for your preparedness. Very briefly, Mr. Takura Shangaja is a blogger who has worked extensively in the Zimbabwean civil society space for close to 2 decades. We feel that this positions him well to talk about mapping opportunities for civil society. So, without further ado, yes, sorry.
Thank you very much. I just need to warn you a little bit. Normally, if I'm at the end of a conference program, I'm accused of wanting to announce pre-written resolutions or decisions that the conference had already made before it occurred. It's always an accusation that I strongly refute. So I'm not here to give you resolutions or a summary of the discourse that preceded in the last 2 days. If we're talking about civil society in Zimbabwe, we definitely have to sort of spare a thought or a moment to think about colleagues in civil society that over the last 2 months have been targeted by the state, charged with allegedly seeking to disrupt or overthrow a constitutionally elected government. And some of them are in prison as we speak. Some of them are out on bail. And in particular, the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Union leadership and some civil society organization leaders, such as the leaders of Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition. So we would have to spare a moment and a thought in solidarity with them before we even discuss mapping out opportunities for civil society. I have already written on this. You'll find it on my blog. If you Google my name, you find the extensive write-up on it. It's not academic though. It's activist. The subtitle I'd given this topic was A Return to a Critical National Consciousness. And I'd given it that particular subtitle primarily because we do have a challenge of national consciousness in Zim, a critical national consciousness for that matter, whether you're thinking about Fanon or you're just thinking about criticality for its own sake, a critical national consciousness. And we need to return to it. I mention a return because historically civil society, in Zimbabwe in particular, has always been counter-hegemonic. It has always been somewhat organic, stemming from a people's grievances, communities' grievances, challenging a repressive state. And this is before independence. Some of you may not know Charles Msingelis. You may not know a lot of our African Pentecostal churches and so on, resisting the colonial state. Civil society, therefore, if you want to call it progressive civil society, is counter-hegemonic civil society. This is not to say the state does not have its own civil society, or a repressive state cannot create its own civil society. It can. But we need to qualify civil society here. Progressive civil society that is counter-hegemonic, that seeks always people-centered solutions to problems that are occurring within the state. In fact, one of the first times I encountered the definition of civil society was from reading, I think, Professor Lloyd Sachikonye's write-up on civil society in Southern Africa and social movements. I put the link on the blog, so don't worry. And a key thing about it is that it is demonstrably clear that progressive civil society acts on behalf of a greater number of people. And it is largely people-centered, and it is counter-hegemonic to repressive norms and state policies as they occur. And in that, a progressive civil society is ideological. If you're looking at pre-independence, majority of civil society, even though they did not always claim it, they were ideologically nationalist. As we got closer to independence, the parties that they had helped to form became, if you want to call it, socialist, mainly because of global Cold War, but also because of the deliberate intention on the part of the liberation parties, formed initially by civil society actors, and also taken an ideological leaning towards the left. Post-independence, you're looking at as being more socialist as progressive civil society, And it's an important point to make because post-1980 in Zim, particularly Labour, as formed and informed by the ruling ZANU-PF party then, was very socialist. But it, again, as civil society, in a manner similar to pre-independence, then decides to be counter-hegemonic. It was in bed with the state post-independence. It decides later on with the introduction of structural adjustment becomes counter-hegemonic. It moves from socialism to social democracy. I wish Dr. Kanyenzi was here. That is when we started encountering a document written by the labor movement called Beyond ISAP, which was essentially talking about a people-centered economic framework. Not necessarily socialism, but clearly social democracy. But when we come closer now to the millennium, civil society stops being as progressive as it could be, particularly in the historical sense. We become less ideological, and we become less counter-hegemonic on our own. We become more affiliated to other political parties, whether we are war veterans with the ruling party, or whether we are Labour, we form a Labour party. These are important things to think about because civil society in Zimbabwe, progressive civil society in Zimbabwe, has generally, historically been counter-hegemonic and people-centered. But let me just go to the key issues about opportunities here. And I'll give you these opportunities in 4 parts. The first is that civil society right now in Zimbabwe has to take a step back and analyze itself, both whether it's a social movement format or an organizational format like a typical policy advocacy organization, and reassess where it has come from, especially over the last 10 years. How political polarization in the country has affected directly civil society and made civil society lose its objective independence and its counter-hegemonic significance to our society. Civil society has therefore come not to represent itself, but to represent political views. To the extent that sometimes if you are in a progressive civil society meeting and you argue against, perhaps let's say the opposition neoliberal policies, you'll be attacked, as was being said earlier this morning, whether on social media or elsewhere. So civil society has to take a step back from the political parties it formed or helped to form and reassess its critical counter-hegemonic role in our society. It's a very important point. Secondly, civil society has to re-engage with ideological discourse. And by this, I literally mean almost like a return to understanding Amilcar Cabral's weapon of theory speech at the Tricontinental in 1996, Cuba, Havana. The reason why we must return to theory, the reason why we must return to ideology is because, as Cabral says, we must understand our own weaknesses. We must protect ourselves from our own weaknesses. And in this, our weaknesses are clear in most cases, and some of you know them. I know yesterday we were discussing philanthropy and so on and so on. Membership paying for civil society organizations, mobilizing on the basis of a cause, not on the basis of what the donor is going to give you. And our weaknesses have also been that the convenience of civil society in the neoliberal framework or framing of things basically means we no longer have to think for ourselves. The templates are already given. How you write a logical framework, how you approach a donor, what suits to wear, what suits not to wear. To the extent that we are more or less entering into a field in which we lose our connectedness with ideology and, ironically, with the people. So it is important for civil society in 2019 to return to ideology and to return in particular to counter-hegemonic ideology, to counter the neoliberal narratives coming from both sides of the political divide, but more significantly coming from the global north, where ironically, neoliberalism is on the retreat. Of course, it's being replaced by nationalism, radical or otherwise, Trump's becoming president, and so on and so on. But the whole point is that there is resistance in the global north to neoliberalism. But here we want to embrace it as though we do not know the full import of neoliberalism in our own already poor societies. The second part in which we can consider opportunities is we need to understand this thing that we rarely talk about, generational praxis. One of the problems of traditional civil society in Zim, and it's a new opportunity, and I'm glad Sivio is talking to us about its tracking mechanism, which is largely online. Generational praxis means we must allow our consciousness of old, ideological or otherwise, to pass on to subsequent generations of activists. And this is very important because in the last 2 years, traditional civil society has had some sort of clashes with new civil society. And this new civil society in Zimbabwe has been a civil society of young Zimbabweans who take to social media, who do things on social media and mobilize each other, get an overreaction from the state, and then they dominate the limelight. But because traditional civil society then thought it was always going to be permanently there, it never thought for once that, no, comrades, we need to engage younger people, younger Zimbabweans, to teach them our levels of consciousness, not in order for them to be propagandized by us, but in order for them to do the activism better, and in a way that is more relevant to their own context, their own aspirations. And we have failed to do this because, again, we got into comfort zones. But it is important to seize this opportunity to relink our national consciousness, to a critical consciousness between Comrade Bisai and the young comrades here, to share this knowledge. And I'm glad Comrade Bisai is running the Brigzano Labour Center School. I've been there once or twice. And it's important that there are young activists that are learning more about ideology than they are about just shop floor activism. But when we move from there, and this is the third point about opportunities, we need to understand that even then, if we link up with young Zimbabweans, young activists, young civil society as it were, the mediums of activism have changed. I'll give this as an anecdotal point. I once went to a review of Africa political economy workshop in Dar es Salaam, I think last year. And one of the things that was being discussed was how to interact with young activists, young left-leaning activists. And the problem was none of the traditional academic activists were on social media. And I asked the question, so how do you think you're going to teach young Africans, young leftist activists, the struggle? They're not going to read always the whole article. They're not going to read the whole book. They can't. They're too busy. They don't have time, let alone the amount of money to download the whole book or buy the book in the first place. And the thing that came out for me was that the mediums of activism, just like before, you'd have a newspaper. Huh? You'd start a bi-weekly newspaper to put out your ideological agenda. Now you have to start a blog site. Now you have to start a website. Now you have to have a Twitter account. Even though those mediums, where I would disagree with Arthur though, is that even though those mediums may be controlled by global capital, as it were, but in this case, in our case, the medium has become the message. Activism is now pervaded in various ways, and so is consciousness, critical consciousness. That's why sometimes you say, but what are these guys arguing about on Twitter, on social media? Haven't they read this book? But they haven't read that book because they've never known that book on Twitter. They've never known that concept, that ideological praxis or framework on social media, because you are not there. So we need to understand the fact that consciousness and mediums of activism are gradually shifting to being more immediate, and we need to suit our counter-hegemonic agendas and counter-neoliberal agendas to that. The fourth point that is very important as an opportunity for civil society in 2019, I'll say this one, then I'll give civil society a revolutionary task for 2019. We need to talk back to the global north. I've been in meetings where, in fact, pre-engagement meetings with comrades and colleagues from the global north, and we discuss as Africans, and we say, hey, this is our agenda. This is our organic, people-centered, people-driven agenda. This is what we're going to argue. We're going to tell the comrades from the global north, this is what we think. Caucus, everything is done. We go to the meeting, and you find out, the global north comrades say this, and your colleagues are now all in agreement. He said, but no, guys, we had agreed. We had agreed that we're going to argue on behalf of our context, within our own understanding of our realities. And has learned from Cabral's and so on and Fanon's that solidarity does not just come with a handshake. It's about a shared value system, shared principles, shared visions even, if you want to use that term. And what has happened is that in most cases, we are subservient, both in activism, genuine activism. We try to mimic our activist comrades in the global north and not try as much as is possible to apply our minds to our context. So if you have Occupy Wall Street, you'll try occupy this, and then not understand the context in and of itself. So that every other victory that you undertake is not just measured in your eyes only, or in your context, but you first look to the global north to see, hey guys, were we successful? Did you see they retweeted what we did in Harare? It's a very important point to make because sometimes it affects the criticality of our consciousness. Mimicry does not make us better. Shared values, shared principles make us better. The last point, which is a revolutionary task to Zimbabwean and civil society for 2019. There's been a lot of debate about dialogue. And it's an important debate. But for me, one of the things that I've realized and learned from reading Nyerere and so on is that, and I'll quote Nyerere here, he says, it's not almost always that the mechanisms of democracy reflect the meaning of democracy. It's not always that your election, as was being said by the Prof in the morning, it's not always that your elections relate to a democratic meaning or a democratic future. They can just be events. The revolutionary task for Zimbabwean civil society, which is immediate, at least to begin with, in 2019, it will sound familiar, but it must be done. In any event, that's the Leninist question, what is to be done? To start off greater and meaningful dialogue and debate prior to 2023 elections, Zimbabwean civil society must seek an amendment to the Zimbabwean constitution that gets rid of first past the post and introduces 100% proportional representation. The revolutionary task of Zimbabwean civil society in 2019, you don't have to take up arms. You can proceed as you were. The agenda must, however, be clear. A first past the post system would ensure the diversity of our parliaments, our local governments, and at least get a president elected by an electoral college of parliaments. It will de-individualize our national politics. It will make our politics, as Tendai said on the first day of this conference, make our politics less personal, but more issue-based and more issue-driven. This is very important because, again, a first-past-the-post system, a proportional representation system will ensure the diversity of representation of various views in our policy-making or legislative bodies. This is a fundamental revolutionary task. It will not be easy because those that have the power to change the constitution, again, will refuse because a first-past-the-post helps them stay in power. Your MP will refuse to say, but I'm the one who represents that constituency. Your president will refuse because you say, what if my party wins and then they don't vote me to be the president in parliament? But the clear revolutionary task, to move away from the politics of personalities, politics of superstition, and in particular to move into the politics of representative democracy and diverse views in parliament, in local government, this is the revolutionary task. Thank you very much.